The mansion sat on the edge of the city, towering above the small houses around it. From the outside, it looked like a palace, with wide windows and tall columns. The grand estate belonged to one of the wealthiest men in the country, a man everyone knew, yet no one truly understood. He was a billionaire, admired and feared by many, but he was also very much alone. His name was Richard. Despite his wealth, Richard lived in isolation. His employees came and went, working tirelessly to maintain the grandeur of the mansion. They were paid well, of course, but they were always careful not to step out of line. The housekeepers, the cooks, the gardeners, they all followed the rules. No one dared to get too close to Richard, and no one dared to speak to him unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't just the servants. Even the visitors who came for meetings or parties stayed at a distance. There was something cold and unapproachable about him. His presence filled the room with a quiet tension that made people feel small. He had built his empire with hard work and shrewd business moves, but in doing so, he had lost something precious, his connection to others. Naomi, the daughter of the maid who worked in the mansion, had always noticed Richard's loneliness. She was only 18, but she had grown up in the mansion, watching from the corners of rooms as her mother served the billionaire. Naomi wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid of Richard. In fact, she was curious about him. She had seen him 1,000 times, walking through the grand halls of his mansion, looking out of the windows or sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. She often wondered what was going through his mind. Naomi's mother, Rachel, had worked for Richard for years. She was dedicated to her job, taking care of the house and its many rooms. Richard paid her well, and Naomi knew her mother appreciated the steady work. But even Rachel, who had known Richard for so long, never spoke of him much. Naomi noticed that whenever Richard was around, her mother would speak in hushed tones, her face showing the respect that everyone felt for him. Naomi, on the other hand, was more open with her feelings. She wasn't afraid of asking questions or thinking differently. One day, when Naomi was cleaning the study, she overheard something strange. Richard's voice, normally so calm and controlled, was shaking. Naomi froze, peeking around the corner of the room. She saw Richard sitting at his desk, a pile of papers in front of him. He was holding his head in his hands, his fingers running through his thick hair in frustration. The silence in the room was thick, and Naomi felt a strange sense of guilt for eavesdropping. She didn't want to listen to something so personal, but she couldn't help it. The sound of Richard's voice broke through the silence. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him sound so vulnerable before. Richard had always been the strong, silent type, never showing weakness, never asking for help. But now, here he was, completely undone. Naomi's curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer to the doorway and peeked inside, her eyes focused on Richard. She didn't understand exactly what was happening, but she could tell that something was wrong. Richard's empire, his success, his wealth, it all seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Naomi had heard whispers around the house, rumors, that his business was in trouble, that his investments were failing, and that the once unshakable empire was now crumbling. But she hadn't understood the weight of it until now. Richard looked up at the window, his face pale and tired. Naomi had never seen him look so worn down. He had always been so confident, so in control of everything around him. It was as if the world was slipping away, and no one, not even Richard, could stop it. Naomi felt a pang of sympathy in her chest. She had never thought much about Richard beyond what she saw in the mansion. But now, seeing him like this, she realized that maybe he wasn't as untouchable as everyone thought. Naomi turned to leave the room quietly, but something stopped her. She didn't know what it was, but she felt compelled to do something, anything. She could have walked away, continued with her cleaning, and pretended she hadn't seen anything. But she didn't. She stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. As she glanced around the room, she saw the tissues on Richard's desk already used and crumpled. There was something so human about the moment. Richard, the powerful billionaire, breaking down like anyone else, It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculating businessman that the world saw. Naomi couldn't help but feel a connection to him in that moment. For the rest of the day, Naomi couldn't stop thinking about Richard. She went through her chores, but her mind kept drifting back to the image of him, sitting alone in his office, defeated and vulnerable. She had always known that there was more to him than the distant billionaire persona that everyone else saw. But this was different. This was raw. This was real. As Naomi helped her mother with dinner that evening, she asked quietly, "What's really going on with Mr. Richard? Is everything okay with his company?" Rachel stopped stirring the soup and looked at her daughter, her face tight. "Why do you ask?" she replied, her voice low. Naomi shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Just curious. He seems different lately." Rachel's face softened for a moment, but she quickly returned to her work, brushing off the question. Naomi knew better than to press further. The people who worked for Richard rarely spoke about him, and when they did, it was always with the same respect and distance. But Naomi wasn't like the others. She didn't see Richard as someone unreachable. She saw him as a person, just like her, someone who had feelings, fears, and insecurities. Later that night, Naomi stood by the window in her small room, staring out into the dark sky. She could see the mansion in the distance, the lights in the windows flickering. She thought about Richard again, how he had been alone, struggling with the weight of his own world. Naomi didn't know how she could help him. But one thing was certain. She couldn't just stand by and watch him suffer. Something deep inside her stirred, and she knew that if she could find a way to make him feel human again, to show him that there was more to life than just power and money, she would. And so, Naomi's journey began. Not with grand gestures, but with something simple, something real. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, she was the only person who could see through the walls Richard had built around himself. As the weeks passed, Naomi couldn't help but wonder if she could be the one to break through, to reach him in a way no one else ever had. The story was only beginning, and neither Naomi nor Richard knew what lay ahead. But one thing was clear. Their paths were about to cross in a way that neither of them had ever imagined. And Naomi, the quiet daughter of the Maid, would be the one to show Richard that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. This part explores Richard's internal struggle and Naomi's growing awareness of his vulnerability. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the next part or make adjustments. Naomi had never quite realized how deeply she had been affected by her brief encounter with Richard in the study. The image of him, sitting alone, his face in his hands, kept haunting her every night. No matter how much she tried to focus on her daily chores, she couldn't stop thinking about him. What was it that had made her so drawn to him? What was it about that moment, him vulnerable and human, something no one else had ever seen, that made her feel as though she understood him in a way others couldn't? Life at the mansion continued as usual. Naomi went about her duties, with her usual quiet grace, helping her mother with the cleaning and tending to the tasks that came with living in a house of such grand size. But things had changed for her, even if no one else seemed to notice. She could no longer look at Richard the same way. He was no longer just the billionaire who owned the mansion. He was someone who had real problems, real emotions, someone who felt pain. That made her feel something deep in her heart, a deep sense of empathy. She didn't pity him, but she understood that even someone as powerful as him needed someone to talk to, someone to lean on. As the days went by, Naomi noticed that Richard's presence had started to change in small ways. He still maintained the same cold exterior, but there was something different about him now. His meetings, once filled with confident decisions and sharp commands, were quieter. The tension in the air seemed heavier, and sometimes Naomi could hear him sigh deeply as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. One afternoon, while Naomi was carrying a tray of freshly baked cookies to the kitchen, she heard a voice. It wasn't loud or angry, but it was filled with frustration and sadness. Naomi turned to find Richard standing in the hallway, staring at a portrait on the wall. It was a picture of him when he was much younger, smiling and proud, a time when he still seemed full of hope and ambition. But now, as Naomi looked at him, she saw that same hope was gone. replaced with something darker. He was just standing there, his face unreadable, as if lost in thought. Naomi felt a strange pull, a sense that this was the moment to do something. She walked quietly toward him, her footsteps soft on the marble floors. She didn't know why, but she felt the urge to speak, to reach out to him. But she also knew it had to be done carefully. She couldn't simply ask him how he was or offer advice. That wouldn't be right. Instead, she stopped beside him and placed the tray of cookies gently on the table nearby. Richard didn't acknowledge her at first, but Naomi wasn't discouraged. She simply stood there, quietly waiting, unsure of what to do next. Eventually, Richard turned to her. His expression softened for a moment, though his eyes still looked distant. "Thank you, Naomi," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if he meant the cookies or something else entirely. Naomi smiled softly. "You're welcome, Mr. Richard," she replied, her voice steady but kind. She didn't want to push him, but something told her that this was the beginning of something important. They stood there for a few moments, the silence between them comfortable but heavy. Richard sighed again, this time louder, as though the weight of everything was too much to bear. Finally, he spoke again, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Naomi," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "Everything is falling apart. I've built this empire for years, and now it's all slipping through my fingers. I can't even seem to hold on to what matters." Naomi felt a pang of sympathy, but she didn't know how to respond. She couldn't pretend to understand the stress and pressure that came with running a massive business empire. But she knew what it was like to feel alone, to feel like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. She wanted to help, but how could she? What could she say to someone like Richard, who had everything and yet still felt empty? She took a deep breath, deciding to speak from her heart. "Sometimes, when everything feels like it's falling apart, it's not about holding on to what you have. It's about finding the people who care about you, the ones who can remind you that you don't have to do it all alone." Richard looked at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected such a response. He seemed to process her words for a long moment, and Naomi felt her heart race. Did he understand? Did he even hear? "I've forgotten how to trust people," Richard murmured, his voice almost lost in the air. "I've been so focused on my business, on maintaining this image of power, that I lost sight of what really matters. And now I'm afraid it's too late." His shoulders slumped, and Naomi noticed how fragile he looked in that moment. He wasn't the towering figure of authority she had always seen. He was just a man struggling to hold on to something he didn't even fully understand. Naomi, unsure of what to do next, took a step closer to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, not out of pity, but out of a desire to offer him something he hadn't had in a long time: human connection. "It's never too late," she said softly. "You're not alone, Mr. Richard. You may not see it right now, but there are people who care. And sometimes, it's okay to ask for help." For a brief moment, Richard's eyes softened, and Naomi saw a flicker of something in his gaze. It was like he was searching for something in her, something real, something he had forgotten was still out there. But just as quickly, the hardness returned to his eyes. He pulled away from her, looking down at his shoes as if ashamed of his vulnerability. "I don't know if I can let anyone in," he said, almost to himself. "I've built this life around being strong, being independent. I don't know how to change now." Naomi took a step back, her hand falling from his shoulder. She understood his hesitation. Trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to come naturally. And Richard wasn't ready to open up yet. But Naomi also knew that something had shifted. For the first time, she saw a crack in the fortress that Richard had built around himself, and that, she thought, was a beginning. "Take your time," Naomi said quietly, her voice full of understanding. "When you're ready, you'll find that there are people who will listen, who will support you. But it starts with you, with being willing to let others in." Richard nodded slowly, still lost in his thoughts. Naomi didn't expect an immediate change, but she knew that the first step had been taken. For now, that was enough. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel that she had made a difference, no matter how small. Richard was still distant, still wrapped up in his own struggles. But perhaps, just perhaps, Naomi had opened a door for him. A door that would eventually lead him back to the people who cared about him. And she was willing to wait, to be there when he was ready to walk through it. This part explores Naomi's growing empathy for Richard and the beginning of their deeper connection. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with the next part or make any. The days that followed were quiet, yet something had shifted in the mansion. Naomi could feel it in the air, a subtle change in Richard. He was still the same man, powerful and wealthy, but there was a softness in his demeanor that had never been there before. It was as though Naomi's words had cracked the wall he had built around himself, and now, little by little, he was starting to let the light in. She noticed this the next time they crossed paths. Naomi was busy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the household. The kitchen was always bustling with activity, but today it felt oddly peaceful, as though the chaos of the outside world had momentarily disappeared. Naomi was chopping vegetables when Richard entered. She didn't hear him at first, but when she turned around, there he was, standing in the doorway. For a moment, Naomi was startled. She hadn't expected him to be there. Richard rarely spent time in the kitchen. He usually had his meals in the grand dining room, served by the butlers. Yet here he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Richard said, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. Naomi smiled, trying to hide the surprise she felt. She had never seen him act this way before. Normally, Richard was a man of few words, a man who didn't waste time with pleasantries, but now he seemed uncertain, almost hesitant. "It's no problem, Mr. Richard," Naomi replied, wiping her hands on a towel and moving toward him. "What can I help you with?" Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking. I was wondering if you could help me with something," he said. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Naomi hadn't expected. It was rare for Richard to ask for help, let alone from someone like Naomi. He was the one who was always in control, always giving orders, never on the receiving. But now it seemed as though he was reaching out, looking for someone to listen. "What is it?" Naomi asked, her voice soft and inviting. She sensed that whatever he was about to say was important, and she was determined to listen. Richard took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm not sure how to fix this," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "My company, it's falling apart. I've made so many mistakes and now it feels like there's no way out. I thought I had everything under control, but I don't. And it's hard to admit that." Naomi's heart went out to him. She had always seen Richard as a man of strength, someone who commanded respect and admiration. But now, standing before her, he seemed fragile. The weight of his failure was written all over him, and Naomi could see how deeply it affected him. "Everyone makes mistakes," Naomi said gently. She had heard whispers around the mansion about the problems with Richard's company, but she had never known the full extent of it. "What matters is that you learn from them. You can't change the past, but you can decide what to do next." Richard looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He seemed to be processing her words, trying to make sense of them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the minutes slipping by unnoticed. "I don't know what to do anymore," Richard finally said, his voice quieter this time. "I've spent so many years building this company, and now it's slipping away. It feels like everything I've worked for is vanishing. I don't know if I can fix it, and I don't know if I even want to try anymore." Naomi could see how deeply Richard was struggling. She didn't have the answers he was looking for, but she could offer him something just as important: her support. She placed a hand on his arm, a small but meaningful gesture. "You don't have to fix it alone," she said softly. "It's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to take a step back and breathe. You've done so much already. Maybe it's time to focus on what really matters, your well-being and the people who care about you. You don't have to carry all of this on your own." Richard looked at her, his expression softening. There was something about Naomi's words that made him feel a little lighter, like a burden had been lifted, even if just for a moment. He had spent so many years focused on his business, on his empire, that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone truly listen. Naomi wasn't offering him advice on how to fix his company or how to save his wealth. She was offering him something simpler, understanding. And that was something he hadn't realized he needed until now. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt seen. Naomi wasn't looking at him as the billionaire, the businessman. She was looking at him as a person, someone who was struggling, just like everyone else. "I don't know how to thank you," Richard said, his voice full of sincerity. "I've been so focused on my business, on making everything perfect, that I've lost sight of what's really important. I've pushed people away, even the ones who care about me, and I'm sorry for that." Naomi smiled, her heart warm with empathy. "You don't have to apologize. We all get caught up in things sometimes. What matters is that you're starting to see things differently now. It's okay to take a step back and breathe." Richard nodded slowly, his mind clearly still working through everything she had said. Maybe you're right," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe I've been so focused on the wrong things. I've built this empire, but it's never been about the people around me. Maybe I need to change that." Naomi's words had sparked something inside him, a realization that he didn't have to face his struggles alone, that it was okay to lean on others, to accept help. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. As Naomi finished preparing the breakfast, Richard stood there for a few more moments, lost in thought. He wasn't the same man who had entered the kitchen moments ago. He had opened up, something he had never done before, and it felt both terrifying and freeing. "Thank you, Naomi," Richard said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I can fix everything overnight, but I'll try to take it one step at a time." Naomi smiled, glad that she could offer him even a small sense of peace. "You're welcome. Just remember it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Richard nodded and left the kitchen, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than before. Naomi watched him go, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her heart. She hadn't fixed everything for him, but she had given him something valuable, a reminder that it was okay to be human, to be vulnerable, and to trust someone else. As the day went on, Naomi felt a quiet hope growing inside her. She didn't know where this journey with Richard would lead, but she knew that for the first time he wasn't alone anymore, and that, she thought, was a start. This part deepens the emotional connection between Naomi and Richard, showing how their conversations begin to have a real impact on him. Let me know if you'd like to move on to the next part or make any adjustments. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Naomi began to notice more changes in Richard. The once cold and distant billionaire who had never shown any vulnerability was starting to soften. He wasn't the man he had been before, the man who hid behind walls of wealth and power. Now he seemed more grounded, more aware of the world outside his empire. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Richard had begun to show up in places he never used to visit, the garden where Naomi often worked, or even the small family rooms where the staff would take their breaks. At first he didn't say much. He simply observed, walking slowly as if he was trying to find a connection with the world he had always ignored. Naomi would catch glimpses of him as she went about her work, noticing how different he looked when he wasn't surrounded by the cold business meetings and boardrooms. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Naomi hadn't seen before. One afternoon, as Naomi was trimming the roses in the garden, Richard appeared in the doorway, looking out into the yard. Naomi didn't expect him to approach. She had become used to his quiet presence, how he would linger at the edges of the mansion, watching but never engaging. But today was different. Today, Richard walked toward her with a determined step. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice low but sincere. Naomi was surprised, but she smiled. It was rare for Richard to ask for help, especially with something as simple as gardening. "You can hold this," she replied, handing him a pair of gardening Gloves. It's not much, but you might find it relaxing. Richard hesitated for a moment before accepting the gloves. He seemed unsure, like he wasn't quite sure how to begin. Naomi gave him a reassuring smile, and together, they worked side by side in the garden, the only sound being the gentle snipping of the shears and the rustle of the leaves in the wind. As they worked, Richard began to talk. It wasn't anything monumental at first, simple words about the weather, about the flowers but it was a start. Naomi could feel the walls between them continuing to crumble. Richard wasn't just the billionaire now. He was a person, someone who could talk about something as simple as gardening. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Richard said, his voice quieter now, as though the act of working together had put him at ease. "I've always been too focused on my work. I didn't have time for things like this. It's strange, but I think I'm starting to enjoy it." Naomi looked up at him, surprised by his words. "It's funny, isn't it? How simple things can bring so much peace. The world moves so fast, and sometimes we forget that there's beauty in slowing down." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the roses they were trimming. "I spent so many years building this empire, trying to create something bigger than myself, that I forgot what really mattered. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about the people, the connections, the relationships, and I've lost all of that." Naomi stopped for a moment, looking at Richard with understanding. "It's not too late to change that. You've already made a step by being here, by showing up and trying something different. It doesn't have to be about fixing everything at once. Sometimes it's about finding small moments that remind us what really matters." Richard met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, Naomi saw a hint of hope in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Maybe Naomi was right. Maybe he didn't need to fix everything all at once. Maybe he just needed to allow himself to enjoy the moments that life offered, to connect with people who cared, and to let go of the need for control. That afternoon in the garden was a turning point. Richard, once so guarded, now seemed to seek moments like this. Simple, quiet moments where he could be himself, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. Naomi had given him something precious, a space where he could feel human again, not just the billionaire who had everything, but the man who had once been a boy with dreams and emotions. Over the next few weeks, Richard continued to show up, in the garden, always offering to help with small tasks. Naomi could see the change in him. He wasn't rushing anymore, not trying to control everything around him. Instead, he was letting go, piece by piece. The loneliness that had once haunted him seemed to be fading, replaced by a new sense of openness. One evening, after a long day of working in the garden, Richard and Naomi sat together on a bench, the sun setting behind them. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment everything felt calm. Naomi was quiet, simply enjoying the beauty of the moment. Richard, however, seemed to be deep in thought. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity, "about how it's never too late to change. I've spent so much of my life trying to build something that didn't really matter. I thought success was the key to everything. But now I realize I've lost touch with what's truly important." Naomi turned to him, her heart full of understanding. "It's not about what you've lost, Richard. It's about what you choose to do next. You can't change the past, but you can shape the future. And it starts with being true to yourself." Richard looked at her, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I don't know if I'll ever get everything back, but I do know this. I'm not alone anymore. And that's something I never realized I needed until now." The words hung in the air between them, and Naomi felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had helped Richard find something he had been searching for, not just success or power, but a connection, a way to embrace the present and look to the future with hope. As they sat there watching the sunset together, Naomi realized that the journey she had begun with Richard was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still obstacles to face, but they were no longer facing them alone. They were in this together. And in that moment, Naomi knew that, despite the odds, things could get better. Sometimes, all it took was the willingness to open up, to let go of the walls, and to find the beauty in the small everyday moments. That was where true change began, and it was only the beginning. This part highlights Richard's gradual transformation and the growing connection between him and Naomi. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the final part or make any adjustments. Over time, Richard and Naomi's relationship began to take on a new dynamic. What had started as a simple, quiet connection in the garden had now grown into something deeper. Richard, the man who had once been unreachable and isolated, now found himself looking forward to the moments he spent with Naomi. She had become more than just the maid's daughter. She had become someone he could rely on, someone who made him feel seen. It wasn't just the moments they spent together in the garden. Anymore, Richard would seek out Naomi in the halls of the mansion, asking her opinion on small matters, sharing a brief conversation about something that wasn't business-related. He no longer seemed like the distant billionaire who hid his emotions behind a facade of wealth and power. Instead, he seemed more human, more willing to open up to those around him. Naomi had always been patient with him, never pushing him to talk or open up when he wasn't ready. She knew that trust couldn't be rushed, and she respected the space Richard needed to heal. She could see the small changes in him, how he smiled more often now, how he didn't keep his head buried in paperwork for hours at a time, how he took more interest in the world around him. He was learning to breathe again, to live again, not just exist behind the walls of his empire. One evening, as Naomi was finishing up her chores in the kitchen, Richard appeared at the door, looking more relaxed than usual. He had been spending more time in the mansion's small library, reading books and reflecting on what Naomi had said to him weeks ago. The tension that had once surrounded him seemed to be melting away. "Naomi," Richard said, his voice carrying a sense of calm. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about finding what really matters. I've realized that you were right all along. I've spent my life chasing something that was never truly fulfilling. It's not the money or the business that's important. It's the connections we make with others, the people who care about us. I've been so focused on myself and my empire that I forgot to look around me." Naomi looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. She had never pushed Richard to change. She had simply been there for him, offering him the one thing he had needed most: understanding. And now she saw the results of their conversations, the way Richard was beginning to find his way back to the life he had once dreamed of before his business consumed him. "I'm glad to hear you say that," Naomi replied, her voice soft. "It's not easy to see things differently, especially when you've been so focused on something for so long. But I believe you're on the right path." Richard smiled, his eyes warm. "I can't fix everything overnight, but I'm starting to see that it's not about fixing everything at once, it's about taking small steps one day at a time." Naomi nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had watched Richard struggle for so long, but now she saw a man who was finding peace in the simplest of moments. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself. A few weeks later, Richard made an important decision. He called a meeting with his board of directors, the very people who had once been so focused on the company's bottom line that they had lost sight of the bigger picture. Richard's tone was different this time, calmer, more introspective. He spoke about the importance of balance, of caring for the people who made the company what it was, of being there for his employees, not just as a boss, but as a human being. The board was stunned. They had never heard Richard speak like this before. They had always admired his drive, his determination, his ability to push the company forward. But now, they were seeing a different side of him. A side that was open, vulnerable, and willing to prioritize the well-being of his employees over profits. Naomi watched from the sidelines as Richard stood before his team, speaking with conviction and sincerity. She could see the change in him, the way he had found a sense of purpose beyond wealth and success. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was a man who cared about people, who understood the importance of connection and community. The results of that meeting weren't immediate, but they were profound. Richard began to shift his company's focus. He invested in his employees' well-being, making sure they had the resources and support they needed to thrive. He also began to scale back the pressure he had put on himself to constantly achieve, more realizing that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The company slowly began to recover, but more importantly, Richard found something that had eluded him for years: a sense of peace. Naomi continued to work at the mansion, but now her role felt different. She wasn't just the maid's daughter anymore. She had become an integral part of Richard's journey, someone who had helped him rediscover himself. The connection they shared wasn't just about kindness or empathy. It was about understanding that people needed each other. And in that shared understanding, both of them had healed. One evening, as Richard and Naomi sat together in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky with beautiful colors, Richard turned to her with a thoughtful look on his face. "I never would have thought that a simple conversation could change so much," he said quietly. "You've shown me that there's more to life than wealth and power. It's about being present, about appreciating the people who truly matter." Naomi smiled, her heart full. "It's never about the things we accumulate. It's about the relationships we build, the moments we share with others. That's what makes life meaningful." Richard nodded, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "I'm glad I met you, Naomi. You've helped me see the world in a way I never thought was possible. And for that, I'll always be grateful." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat, but she held it back, smiling softly. "I'm just glad I could help," she replied, her voice gentle. "We all need someone to remind us of what really matters. You've made those changes on your own, Richard. I just gave you a little nudge in the right direction." For a long while they sat together in silence, the peacefulness of the moment enveloping them both. Naomi had never expected that her simple act of kindness would lead to such a profound change in Richard. She had never expected that their paths would cross in such a meaningful way. But now, as she sat beside him, she knew that their lives would always be connected, not because of wealth or status, but because they had found something much more valuable: understanding, compassion, and the realization that they were not alone. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Richard turned to Naomi with a smile. "Thank you for everything," he said quietly. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what truly matters." Naomi smiled back at him, her heart light. "You're welcome," she whispered, knowing that in that moment they both had found something precious, not in the world they had known before, but in the simple moments that had brought them closer. And so, their story continued, a story of transformation, of connection, and of the quiet power of kindness. They were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were two souls linked by understanding, learning together how to navigate the complexities of life and finding beauty in the simplest of moments. This final part shows the culmination of Richard's transformation, with Naomi's influence, guiding him toward a more balanced and meaningful life. It also emphasizes the importance of human connection and the impact of small, compassionate gestures. Let me know if you'd like to refine anything further.